Picture this. It's 1974. America is in a fuel crisis. Gas lines stretch for blocks. And in the middle of all this chaos, a mechanic nobody could shut up or slow down rolls into Daytona with a truck engine, straps a turbocharger to it, and proceeds to humiliate every single purpose-built NASCAR V8 on the track. Not by a little, by a lot. And then NASCAR did something nobody expected. They didn't congratulate him. They didn't celebrate the innovation. They buried it. They changed the rules overnight, retroactively, specifically to make sure that engine never competed again. That's the story we're telling today. This is Legacy Engines, and I spend way too much time thinking about the engineering decisions that changed motorsport forever. If you're someone who loves the hidden history behind racing technology, the stories that never made the highlight reels, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now, before we get into what Smokey Yunick actually built, we need to understand why this story matters beyond the garage. Because here's the thing, this isn't just about one eccentric mechanic tinkering with a truck motor. This is about what happens when a sport built on tradition collides head-on with genuine innovation. And spoiler alert, tradition usually wins, not because it deserves to, but because the people protecting it have more money and more influence than the person challenging it. That's a pattern you'll see repeat itself throughout racing history and, honestly, throughout most of human history. But Smokey's story is one of the most dramatic versions of it ever recorded. So let me set the scene properly. The early 1970s in NASCAR were defined by one thing: displacement. Bigger was always better. The accepted wisdom was simple and brutal. You wanted to win on Sunday, you needed cubic inches. Ford, Chrysler, and Chevrolet factory programs were spending what today would amount to tens of millions of dollars developing big block V8 engines. The 427, the 426 Hemi, the Boss 429. These were purpose-built weapons disguised as production engines, and they screamed to 7,000 RPM, making somewhere between 500 and 600 horsepower. They broke constantly. They cost fortunes to rebuild. And everyone, every single person inside NASCAR, accepted this as the only possible way to go racing. Nobody questioned it. Nobody even thought to question it. The V8 was as fundamental to NASCAR as the oval track itself. Now, you might be thinking, well, of course, V8s are what NASCAR has always been about. And that's exactly the problem. When everyone assumes something is permanent and unquestionable, they stop looking for better solutions. And Smokey Yunick never stopped looking. Henry Smokey Yunick was not a conventional thinker. His shop in Daytona Beach was described by competitors as a fortress of secrets, and that description was accurate in every sense. He worked alone, he trusted almost nobody, and he had a particular gift for reading rule books not as limitations but as map. He didn't look for what was allowed. He looked for what wasn't explicitly forbidden. There's a crucial difference there, and it was the foundation of his entire career. He famously said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that he didn't cheat, he merely capitalized on the rule book's vagueness. Whether you call that genius or gamesmanship probably depends on whether you were the one being beaten by it. Here's what most people don't realize about the context that made this moment possible. The 1973 oil crisis didn't just affect ordinary Americans waiting in gas lines. It created a genuine public relations crisis for NASCAR. The sport's entire identity was built around burning fuel at spectacular rates, and suddenly that identity was deeply unpopular. NASCAR officials found themselves publicly discussing efficiency, smaller engines, fuel economy regulations. It was largely performative, but the language created an opening, and Smokey walked straight through it. Look, here's where the real genius begins. While everyone else in NASCAR was focused on squeezing more power from bigger and bigger V8s, Smokey went in the completely opposite direction. He went to a Chevrolet delivery truck. Specifically, he pulled out the Chevy 292 cubic inch inline 6-cylinder engine. And if you've never heard of the 292, that's kind of the point. This was the most anonymous, unglamorous engine General Motors had ever produced. Introduced in 1963 as a heavy-duty truck power plant, it made 165 horsepower at 4,000 RPM in stock form. 165. NASCAR V8s were making more than 3 times that. Engineers who worked with the 292 called it reliable. They called it dependable. They called it an anchor. Nobody, and I mean nobody, called it fast. But Smokey saw something everyone else missed. That long 4.125-inch stroke, the same stroke length that made the 292 perfect for low-end truck torque, was also perfect for turbocharging. More stroke means more cylinder volume per revolution, which means more air and fuel can be forced in under boost pressure. The cast iron block, overbuilt for truck abuse, could handle the cylinder pressures that would crack a lighter racing block. And those 7 main bearings gave the engine a rigidity that most purpose-built racing motors struggled to match. On paper, the 292 was a joke. In Smokey's mind, it was a foundation. He also had a political angle that was almost too clever. Remember, NASCAR was still publicly pretending to care about fuel efficiency. A 6-cylinder engine, even a turbocharged one, would consume noticeably less fuel than a comparably powerful V8. Smokey could stand in front of any camera and say he was giving NASCAR exactly what it claimed to want. Efficiency through engineering, not brute force displacement. It was the perfect Trojan horse. Walk in looking like the solution to NASCAR's PR problem, and then detonate everything they believed about power and performance from the inside. This is where it gets really interesting because building the engine was only half the challenge. The real problem was the turbocharger itself. In 1974, turbochargers had a reputation for being exotic, temperamental, and catastrophically unreliable in racing applications. They were Indianapolis technology, not Daytona technology. The turbo lag alone, the delay between pressing the throttle and feeling the power arrive, made them dangerous on short tracks where instant response separated clean laps from concrete walls. Teams that had experimented with turbochargers in stock car racing had mostly abandoned them after expensive and embarrassing failures. But here's the thing about Smokey that his competitors consistently underestimated. He didn't just bolt parts together and hope for the best. He engineered solutions. Every problem he anticipated, he solved before it became a failure on track. The exhaust manifold was entirely his own design, built to collect flow from 6 cylinders and maintain the velocity needed to spool the turbo efficiently. The wastegate was purely mechanical, a spring-loaded valve calibrated through extensive testing. He built a custom air-to-air intercooler from aircraft aluminum because he understood that compressed air generates heat, and hot air is less dense, and less dense air means less oxygen, and less oxygen means less power and more detonation risk. He solved the carburetor problem, which had killed most turbo attempts before his, by mounting it inside a pressurized enclosure so the pressure differential across the venturis remained constant under boost. That single solution alone was worth years of development time, and Smokey figured it out himself. When he finally put his turbocharged 292 on a dynamometer, the numbers came back at somewhere between 450 and 500 horsepower, from 292 cubic inches. NASCAR's V8s, at 427 cubic inches, were making 500 to 550. Smokey's engine was producing roughly 1.7 horsepower per cubic inch compared to about 1.2 from the V8s. The displacement disadvantage had been completely erased, and the power curve told an even better story. Where V8s made their power high in the RPM range and went relatively soft below 4,000, Smokey's turbocharged 6 pulled hard from 3,000 all the way to 6,000. It was easier to drive, more forgiving out of corners, and significantly lighter than a big block V8, probably 100 to 150 pounds lighter overall. When the turbocharged 292 rolled into Daytona for its first test session, The reaction from competitors was exactly what you'd expect. Laughter. Genuine, dismissive, condescending laughter. A truck engine at NASCAR's most famous track. This had to be another one of Smokey's publicity stunt. The man was known for pulling elaborate technical tricks to generate attention, and surely this was more of the same. Competitors walked past the car shaking their head. Factory engineers from Ford and Chrysler glanced over, smirked, and went back to their own work. The idea that a Chevy delivery truck motor could threaten their multi-million-dollar V8 programs was so absurd it wasn't even worth serious consideration. And then Smokey posted his first qualifying time. The laughter stopped. Not because the time was record-breaking. It wasn't. But it was competitive. Genuinely, legitimately competitive with cars running 427 cubic inch purpose-built racing V8s. That shouldn't have been possible. Everyone in the paddock knew it shouldn't have been possible. And yet the timing sheets didn't lie. The truck engine from Chevy was running with the big boys, and nobody had an explanation for it. Here's what most people don't realize about what happened next. The discomfort wasn't really about the lap times. It was about the sound. NASCAR tracks have a particular acoustic signature that fans and competitors have internalized over decades. The deep, thundering, almost violent exhaust note of a big block V8 at full throttle is part of the sport's identity. It's emotional. It's visceral. It communicates power in a language everyone understands before they even look at a tachometer. Smokey's turbocharged 292 didn't sound like that. It produced a smooth inline six hum layered over an unmistakable turbo whistle, a sound more associated with Indianapolis or sports car racing than with Daytona. It sounded foreign. It sounded wrong in a way that was genuinely unsettling to people who had spent their careers in NASCAR garages. That sound mattered more than most technical analyses acknowledge. Because in motorsport, and really in any competitive environment, identity and culture are often more powerful forces than engineering data. The V8 wasn't just an engine choice. It was a declaration of values. American, loud, direct, powerful through sheer force of will rather than technical cleverness. Smokey's six-cylinder turbo represented the opposite philosophy, and that philosophical challenge was more threatening than the lap times. The second test session was faster. Smokey had gone back to his data, made adjustments, refined the boost curve, tweaked the ignition timing, and came back quicker. Now competitors weren't just paying attention, they were actively concerned. Factory engineers who had initially dismissed the car began taking note. Teams that had laughed the loudest were suddenly asking quiet questions in the paddock, trying to understand what Smokey had actually built. The third test session was faster still, and at that point, the mood shifted from concern to anger. Now, you might be thinking, why anger? Shouldn't innovation be celebrated in a sport built on mechanical ingenuity? And that's a completely reasonable question that reveals exactly how naive most people are about the economics of professional motorsport. Look, NASCAR in the early 1970s wasn't just a racing series. It was a marketing platform for American automobile manufacturers, and those manufacturers had made enormous financial commitments based on a very specific set of assumptions about how competition worked. Ford had spent years and what today would be tens of millions of dollars developing the Boss 429. Chrysler's 426 Hemi program was legendary and expensive. These weren't just racing engines. They were engineering showcases, proof that these companies could out-engineer their competitors through brute force and unlimited resources. Smokey's turbocharged 292 didn't just threaten to beat those engines on a racetrack. It threatened to make the entire philosophy behind them look primitive. If you could take a truck engine, add a turbocharger, and match the output of a purpose-built 427, then what exactly had all that factory money actually bought? The answer was uncomfortable. It had bought tradition. It had bought familiarity. It had bought the comfort of doing things the way they'd always been done. And that wasn't worth much when a truck motor was posting competitive lap times at Daytona. Here's where it gets really interesting, because the response from factory teams wasn't to out-engineer Smokey. It was to out-politics him. Representatives from Ford and Chrysler went directly to NASCAR officials. The conversations weren't recorded and the details vary depending on who you ask, but the broad strokes are consistent across multiple historical accounts. The factories made their position clear. The turbocharger situation was a problem that needed to be addressed. The implication was equally clear. Factory support, financial support, the kind of support that kept NASCAR financially viable, was contingent on the sanctioning body taking this seriously. NASCAR founder Bill France Sr. was a genuinely brilliant businessman, and he understood the situation immediately. He couldn't ban Smokey's engine outright. That would be too transparent, too obviously political. The rule book clearly showed turbochargers were legal. Banning them specifically to stop one competitor who had broken no rules would be a credibility disaster. So France needed a solution that looked principled on paper while achieving the same result as an outright ban. And he found one. The solution was an equivalency formula. The argument went something like this. Forced induction engines artificially increase effective displacement by forcing more air into the cylinders than natural atmospheric pressure would deliver. Therefore, to create fair competition, turbocharged engines needed their actual displacement multiplied by a factor to reflect their true competitive equivalent. The multiplier NASCAR chose was 1.7. Do the math on Smokey's 292, and you get 496.4 cubic inches, well above the 427 maximum. Overnight, without Smokey violating a single existing rule, his engine became illegal. The cynicism of this move deserves to be stated plainly. This wasn't a considered policy developed through careful analysis of competitive fairness. The 1.7 multiplier wasn't derived from engineering data or thermodynamic analysis. It was chosen because it produced a number large enough to make the 292 illegal while appearing to be a rational technical standard. NASCAR applied it retroactively, meaning Smokey had built and tested his engine under one set of rules, and then those rules were changed specifically to eliminate what he had created. That's not regulation. That's targeted elimination wearing regulations clothing. Smokey was furious, and his fury was entirely justified. He'd spent months engineering a solution, investing his own money, solving problems that the entire racing establishment had considered unsolvable. He'd followed every written rule. He'd produced results that demonstrated genuine engineering superiority. And his reward was a retroactive rule change designed by the people his engine had embarrassed, implemented by officials who depended financially on those same people. He later wrote about it with characteristic directness, noting that the establishment simply didn't want it because it would have made the racing V8 obsolete and upset the factories. That sentence is worth sitting with for a moment. He wasn't speculating about backroom motivations or constructing a conspiracy theory. He was describing the economic and political reality of professional motorsport with complete clarity. The factories funded NASCAR. NASCAR protected the factories. Smokey's turbocharged 292 threatened the factories. Therefore, NASCAR eliminated the turbocharged 292. The logic was ruthless and entirely straightforward. Now, the broader implications of this decision extended far beyond Smokey Yunick and one turbocharged truck engine. What NASCAR actually did in 1974 was choose the past over the future in a way that would define the sport's technological trajectory for the next 5 decades. Think about what was happening in the rest of the motorsport world simultaneously. Indianapolis racing was already moving aggressively toward forced induction. Formula One was beginning to explore turbocharged engines. Sports car racing was seeing turbocharged Porsches dominate endurance events. The entire global motorsport community was converging on the same conclusion that Smokey had already reached. Turbocharging was the future of performance, and natural aspiration was becoming increasingly obsolete at the cutting edge of competition. By eliminating Smokey's engine, NASCAR wasn't just stopping one innovative competitor. It was insulating itself from a technological evolution that was happening everywhere else, and it was doing so entirely for political and financial reasons that had nothing to do with the quality of the racing or the advancement of automotive technology. The sport chose to protect its existing power structure rather than embrace a better approach, and that choice had consequences that echoed for generations. Here's the thing about technological suppression that most people don't fully appreciate. You can stop an innovation from competing in your specific arena. You cannot stop it from being correct. The turbocharged inline six-cylinder that Smokey built in 1974 was demonstrably superior in multiple measurable ways to the naturally aspirated V8s it was competing against. That superiority didn't disappear because NASCAR changed its rules. The physics didn't change. The thermodynamics didn't change. The engineering reality didn't change. All that changed was whether that reality was allowed to express itself on a NASCAR track. And the rest of the world noticed. While NASCAR clung to its naturally aspirated V8 identity through increasingly elaborate rules designed to prevent exactly the kind of innovation Smokey had demonstrated, other series moved forward. The lessons Smokey had proven, that forced induction could extract competitive power from smaller, lighter, more efficient engines, became gospel truth in every other form of motorsport. Smokey kept his engine. He'd fire it up occasionally for journalists and enthusiasts, running it on a dyno as a demonstration of what had been possible and what had been deliberately prevented. It became a legend in the way that only suppressed innovations become legends, celebrated precisely because it was never allowed to fully compete. The turbocharged 292 never turned a wheel in anger during a real NASCAR race. But the story doesn't end with Smokey's defeat in the boardroom. Because here's the thing about genuinely correct ideas. They don't stay buried forever. They resurface, sometimes quietly, sometimes spectacularly, but they always resurface. And the story of what happened to turbocharging in the years after NASCAR banned Smokey's engine is simultaneously a vindication of everything he proved and an indictment of everything the sanctioning body chose to protect. Let's start with Indianapolis, because Indianapolis is where the first major vindication arrived. By the late 1970s, turbocharged engines weren't a novelty at the brickyard. They were the only serious option. The Cosworth DFX, a turbocharged development of the naturally aspirated DFV that had dominated Formula One, became the engine of choice for competitive IndyCar teams from 1978 onward. In race trim, these engines produced somewhere between 700 and 800 horsepower. In qualifying configuration, running higher boost for a single fast lap, they pushed past 1,000 horsepower. From engines that were physically smaller and lighter than the big block V8s NASCAR was still mandating. Every single principle Smokey had demonstrated with his 292 in 1974 was being applied at Indianapolis on a grander scale and producing exactly the results his dyno numbers had predicted. Forced induction worked. It worked spectacularly. And the engineers at Indianapolis didn't have a Bill France Sr. telling them to stop. Formula One's turbo era began in 1977 when Renault introduced a turbocharged 1.5-liter V6, and the establishment reaction in Formula One was almost identical to what Smokey had experienced in NASCAR. Competitors dismissed it. Officials watched nervously. Traditionalists complained that it wasn't really Formula One racing. And then it started winning. By the early 1980s, every competitive Formula One team was running turbocharged engines. The Renault, the Ferrari, the Honda, the BMW four-cylinder that Tag Porsche used in the McLaren. These engines in qualifying trim were producing numbers that remain almost incomprehensible even today. The BMW M12, a turbocharged four-cylinder derived from a production engine, produced over 1,400 horsepower in qualifying specification from 1.5 liters of displacement. That's more than 900 horsepower per liter. Smokey's 292 had produced roughly 1.7 horsepower per cubic inch, which was revolutionary in 1974. Formula One qualifying engines in 1986 were producing numbers that made Smokey's achievement look conservative. Here's what most people don't realize about the Formula One turbo era and its relationship to Smokey's story. The fundamental engineering insight was identical. You take an engine that appears disadvantaged by displacement, you force compressed air into it, and you extract power levels that naturally aspirated engines of any size cannot match. Renault figured this out independently in Europe. Smokey had figured it out in a Daytona beach garage 2 years earlier with a truck motor. The difference was that Formula One let Renault race. Now, you might be thinking, well, Formula One and NASCAR are completely different contexts. Different rules, different tracks, different traditions. And that's true. But the underlying physics are the same, and that's the point. The reason turbocharging works in Formula One is the same reason it worked in Smokey's 292. Compressed air is denser than atmospheric air. More density means more oxygen. More oxygen means more fuel can be burned. More combustion means more power. These are thermodynamic facts that don't change based on which oval or road course you're applying them to. And then came the Buick Grand National, which is perhaps the most culturally significant vindication of Smokey's philosophy, precisely because it happened on American streets rather than European racetracks. General Motors introduced the turbocharged 3.8-liter V6 Buick Regal in the early 1980s, and by 1987 the GNX version had become something genuinely extraordinary. Official horsepower ratings were listed at 276, a number that automotive journalists immediately recognized as a polite fiction designed to avoid embarrassing Chevrolet's Corvette. Real-world testing consistently showed the GNX producing somewhere north of 300 horsepower, with some examples testing even higher. From 231 cubic inches. A turbocharged six-cylinder was humiliating naturally aspirated V8 muscle cars in straight-line acceleration tests, and doing it repeatedly and consistently enough that it couldn't be dismissed as a fluke. The GNX became famous for destroying Corvettes at stoplight. Magazine tests confirmed what street racers already knew. A turbocharged six-cylinder from Buick, a brand associated with comfortable sedans driven by retired accountants, was faster than America's premier sports car. The automotive press went slightly insane over this. Headlines called it the car that ate Corvette. Road and Track and Car and Driver both confirmed the performance numbers, and every single journalist who wrote about it was, whether they realized it or not, confirming what Smokey Yunick had demonstrated with a truck engine in 1974. Forced induction six-cylinders can match and exceed naturally aspirated V8s of larger displacement. This was not news to Smokey. It was news to everyone else. Look, let's talk about what was happening inside NASCAR during this same period, because the contrast is genuinely remarkable. While Indianapolis was running 1,000-horsepower turbocharged engines, while Formula One was producing 1,400 horsepower qualifying monsters, while Buick was selling turbocharged six-cylinders that embarrassed V8 sports cars, NASCAR was still running naturally aspirated V8s under rules specifically designed to prevent the kind of innovation Smokey had attempted. The engines were spectacular by naturally aspirated standards, refined over decades of development, absolutely optimized within their constraints. But they were operating under an artificial ceiling that had been constructed in 1974 specifically to stop one man with a truck motor and a turbocharger. This is where it gets really interesting, because the long-term consequences for NASCAR's relevance went beyond just engine technology. The connection between NASCAR competition and mainstream automotive development, always somewhat tenuous, essentially disappeared entirely during this period. The sports marketing had always leaned on the idea that racing improved the breed, that lessons learned on Sunday made Monday's cars better. But when the rest of the automotive world moved to forced induction and NASCAR stayed behind a wall of rules preventing that evolution, the connection became fictional. NASCAR wasn't improving any breed. It was carefully preserving a technological approach that the rest of the industry was moving away from. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the cars on NASCAR tracks shared almost nothing with their showroom counterparts except a body template and a brand name on the hood. The engines were purpose-built racing motors with no meaningful relationship to production power plants. The chassis were custom tube frames. The aerodynamics were handcrafted. Calling them stock cars had become a branding decision rather than an accurate description, and everyone inside the sport knew it. The stock in stock car racing had been quietly abandoned somewhere along the way, and the decision to ban Smokey's turbocharged 292 was one of the clearest early markers of that departure. Here's the thing about institutional decisions made for political rather than principled reasons. They tend to require increasingly elaborate structures of additional decisions to maintain their original logic. Once NASCAR decided to ban turbochargers to protect factory V8 programs, it had to keep banning them, because allowing them later would implicitly acknowledge that the original ban was wrong. So each year that passed added another layer of institutional commitment to the naturally aspirated V8 formula. Engineers built careers around it. Teams organized their entire technical infrastructure around it. Sponsors invested based on it. The original political decision calcified into genuine tradition, and genuine tradition is far harder to challenge than mere politics. Smokey Yunick understood this dynamic better than almost anyone. He watched the rest of Motorsport validate his engineering instincts year after year while NASCAR built increasingly elaborate rules to prevent exactly the kind of thinking he represented. He kept working, kept innovating, kept finding edges in rule books and ways to extract performance from unexpected places. But the turbocharged 292 remained his most dramatic statement, the clearest expression of his philosophy, and the most complete example of what happened when that philosophy collided with institutional power. Now let's address something directly, because it comes up every time this story is told. There are people who argue that NASCAR was right to ban turbochargers in 1974, not for political reasons, but for practical ones. The argument goes that turbochargers were genuinely unreliable in that era, that the technology wasn't mature enough for the demands of stock car racing, that allowing them would have created an uneven playing field where only teams with significant engineering resources could compete effectively with forced induction. It's a reasonable argument on its surface, and it deserves a direct response. The reliability argument falls apart when you look at what Smokey actually built. His turbocharged 292 wasn't a fragile prototype that barely held together through a few demonstration laps. It was a carefully engineered system that ran consistently through multiple test sessions, improving each time as Smokey refined the setup. The reliability problems that plagued earlier turbo attempts in racing were exactly the problems Smokey had methodically solved: the carburetor pressurization issue, the intercooler design, the wastegate calibration, the oil cooling for the turbo bearings. He hadn't just proven the concept. He'd proven a specific, refined implementation that actually worked. The uneven playing field argument is even weaker, because naturally aspirated big block V8 development in 1974 was already an extraordinarily expensive undertaking that heavily favored factory-backed teams over independent operators. The playing field was already dramatically uneven. The question wasn't whether Smokey's approach would create inequality in competition. The question was whether it would disrupt the specific hierarchy of inequality that already existed, and the answer was clearly yes, which is precisely why the factories objected. Here's what most people don't realize about the deeper lesson in Smokey's story. The turbocharged 292 was banned not because it didn't work. It was banned because it worked too well and for the wrong person. If a major factory program had developed the same technology, backed by Ford or Chrysler engineering departments and millions of dollars in development funding, the response from NASCAR would almost certainly have been different. The rules would have found a way to accommodate it, because the rules always find a way to accommodate the people who fund the sport. Smokey was an independent operator with no factory backing, which meant he had no political capital to spend when the factories decided his innovation was inconvenient. That reality, that innovation without institutional backing is always vulnerable to institutional suppression, is the central lesson of the turbocharged 292 story. And it's a lesson that extends well beyond motorsport. You can find the same dynamic in pharmaceutical development, in technology patents, in academic research, wherever established interests have enough influence to shape the rules of competition. Genuinely better ideas get suppressed not because they're wrong, but because they're threatening to the right people at the wrong time. Smokey Yunick was right about the engine. He was right about turbocharging. He was right about the future of performance. He was wrong about one thing, and it was the thing that ultimately mattered most in 1974. He assumed that being right was enough. It wasn't enough. Being right has never been enough in any arena where money and power determine the rules. And that's the hardest truth embedded in Smokey's story, the one that separates it from a simple underdog narrative and turns it into something genuinely instructive about how innovation actually works in the real world. Smokey had the engineering. He had the data. He had the lap times. What he didn't have was the financial leverage to make NASCAR protect his innovation instead of suppress it. And without that leverage, everything else was irrelevant. But here's where the story takes a turn that most tellings miss entirely. Because Smokey's defeat wasn't the end of the turbocharged inline six-cylinder's influence on American motorsport. It was actually the beginning of it, just not in the way Smokey intended, and not in a way that gave him any credit while it was happening. The ideas he demonstrated in 1974 spread through the engineering community the way genuinely correct ideas always spread, quietly, through observation and imitation, attributed to everyone except the person who first proved them viable. Engineers who watched those Daytona test sessions went back to their own programs carrying mental notes about what they'd seen. The specific solutions Smokey had developed, the blow-through carburetor setup, the intercooler design, the exhaust manifold geometry for an inline six underboost, these weren't patented. They couldn't be hidden behind corporate walls. They existed in the world now, documented in the memories of everyone who had seen them work. This is how suppressed innovation actually spreads. Not through official channels or credited development programs, but through the informal network of engineers and mechanics who watch things work and remember what they saw. Smokey didn't get a royalty check every time someone applied his principles in a different context. He didn't get acknowledgement in press releases or technical papers. But his fingerprints are on every turbocharged performance application that followed, because he was among the first people to solve the specific practical problems that made turbocharging viable in a racing context on American soil. Now let's talk about what the modern automotive landscape actually looks like, because this is where Smokey's vindication becomes impossible to argue against. According to data from the Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Energy, turbocharged engines now account for more than half of all new vehicles sold in the United States. More than half. In 2023, that percentage was continuing to climb. The naturally aspirated V8 that NASCAR spent 50 years protecting through rules and regulations is now genuinely endangered in mainstream automotive production. Ford discontinued the naturally aspirated V8 in the F-150 pickup truck, the best-selling vehicle in America for over 40 consecutive years. They replaced it with a turbocharged V6 EcoBoost that produces more power, better fuel economy, and superior low-end torque. Sound familiar? That's almost word for word the description of what Smokey's turbocharged 292 offered compared to NASCAR's V8s in 1974. Here's what most people don't realize about the EcoBoost engine's development history. The fundamental engineering principles that Ford applied to make a turbocharged six-cylinder outperform a naturally aspirated V8 in a pickup truck application were not new in 2011 when the EcoBoost F-150 launched. They were not new in 2001 or 1991. They were proven in the 1970s and 1980s through exactly the kind of development that Smokey's test sessions represented. The path from Smokey's turbocharged 292 to the EcoBoost F-150 isn't direct, and it isn't acknowledged in any official Ford documentation. But the engineering logic is identical, and the performance outcomes rhyme so closely that the relationship is impossible to dismiss as coincidence. BMW's current turbocharged inline six-cylinder engines, found in the M340i, the M440i and numerous other models across the lineup, produce between 382 and 510 horsepower depending on specification, from 3 liters of displacement. They're widely considered among the finest engines currently in production by automotive engineers and journalists worldwide. The inline-six turbocharged configuration that Smokey chose for his 292, the same configuration that NASCAR found so threatening and foreign in 1974, is now celebrated as one of the most elegant and effective engine architectures in automotive history. Mercedes-Benz returned to the turbocharged inline-six after decades away. Toyota put one in the Supra. Jaguar uses one in the F-Type. The configuration Smokey was experimenting with when it was genuinely radical is now considered a premium choice. Look, let's talk about the fuel economy numbers specifically, because this is where the contrast between what NASCAR suppressed and what the automotive industry eventually embraced becomes almost painful to examine. Smokey's turbocharged 292 used an estimated 20 to 30% less fuel than comparable naturally aspirated V8s while producing equivalent power. In 1974, during an active fuel crisis, that efficiency advantage was simultaneously one of the engine's strongest arguments and completely irrelevant to the people making the decisions, because those people's financial interests were aligned with the naturally aspirated V8 regardless of how much fuel it burned. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, American transportation accounts for roughly 28% of total energy consumption in the country. The shift from naturally aspirated engines to turbocharged ones that has happened over the past 2 decades has contributed meaningfully to efficiency improvements across the vehicle fleet. The EPA's fuel economy data shows consistent improvement in fleet average fuel economy since turbocharged engines began replacing larger, naturally aspirated units at scale. These are real, measurable improvements in real-world energy consumption, and the engineering principles behind them were demonstrated by one mechanic with a truck engine and a turbocharger in 1974. The scale is different. The applications are different. But the physics are the same physics Smokey proved work. Here's the question that genuinely haunts the story when you follow it to its logical conclusion. What would NASCAR look like today if Smokey's turbocharged 292 had been allowed to compete in 1974? It's a counterfactual, obviously, and counterfactuals are inherently speculative. But let's think through it seriously rather than just gesturing at the possibility. If forced induction had been allowed in NASCAR in 1974, the immediate competitive response would have been enormous. Factory teams would have had no choice but to develop their own turbocharged programs, because the performance advantage Smokey demonstrated was too significant to ignore competitively. Ford, Chrysler, and Chevrolet would have redirected their substantial engineering resources toward forced induction development rather than continuing to extract marginal gains from naturally aspirated big block. This is where it gets really interesting because the factory turbo programs that NASCAR never developed are exactly the programs that Formula One and Indianapolis pursued simultaneously. The engine knowledge, the materials science, the boost control technology, all of it would have evolved under NASCAR's specific constraints of oval racing and production-based component. The results might have been extraordinary. Turbocharged NASCAR engines by the late 1970s could plausibly have been producing 600, 700, potentially 800 horsepower from smaller, lighter, more efficient packages than the big blocks they replaced. The racing would have been faster. The technology would have been more relevant to street car development. The connection between NASCAR competition and mainstream automotive engineering, always the sport's most powerful marketing argument, would have remained genuine rather than becoming fictional. More importantly for NASCAR's long-term cultural relevance, the sport would have been participating in the technological conversation that the rest of the automotive world was having throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Instead of being a nostalgic celebration of an engine format the rest of the industry was abandoning, it would have been a proving ground for technology that consumers were actually encountering in showrooms. The stock-in-stock car racing might have remained meaningful. The breed improvement argument might have stayed honest. NASCAR might have entered the 21st century as a technologically forward sport rather than one scrambling to find relevance in an automotive landscape it had deliberately disconnected itself from. Now, you might be thinking that this is overly harsh on NASCAR, that the sport has been enormously successful by any conventional measure, that television ratings, attendance figures, and commercial revenue tell a story of genuine mainstream appeal that doesn't need technological credibility to sustain itself. And that's fair up to a point. NASCAR was genuinely successful through the 1990s and into the 2000s. But the sport struggles with declining ratings and attendance since roughly 2005 correlate closely with the moment when the gap between NASCAR technology and mainstream automotive reality became impossible for casual fans to ignore. When the car you race on Sunday shares nothing meaningful with the car you drive on Monday, the sport loses its most intuitive hook for the general audience. Smokey Yunick saw this coming. He understood that the connection between racing and relevance wasn't sentimental. It was technical. Racing mattered to ordinary people because it developed and demonstrated technology that eventually made their cars better, faster, and more reliable. Break that connection, and racing becomes pure spectacle, impressive but increasingly abstract. Smokey's turbocharged 292 was an attempt to keep that connection alive at exactly the moment NASCAR chose to sever it. Here's the thing about the people who make decisions to suppress innovation. They rarely think of themselves as suppressors. Bill France Sr. almost certainly believed he was protecting the sport he had built. The factory representatives who pressured him almost certainly believed they were protecting legitimate business investments. The engineers who designed the equivalency formula probably told themselves they were creating competitive fairness. None of them woke up that morning planning to damage NASCAR's long-term relevance. They were responding rationally to the immediate incentives in front of them, protecting current revenue streams and existing power structures against a genuinely threatening disruption. That's how institutional suppression of innovation almost always works. It's not mustache-twirling villainy. It's ordinary people making locally rational decisions that collectively produce outcomes nobody intended and everyone eventually regret. The factory teams that pressured NASCAR to ban Smokey's engine didn't intend to set the sport on a path toward technological irrelevance. They intended to protect their current competitive investments. The long-term consequences were invisible to them in 1974, buried under the immediate financial pressures of factory racing programs and the genuine uncertainty about whether turbocharging would actually prove viable at scale. Smokey never stopped being angry about it. He talked about the turbocharged 292 throughout the rest of his career with a specificity and passion that made clear it remained an open wound. Not just because of the personal loss, though that was real, but because he understood exactly what had been lost beyond his own project. He had offered NASCAR a path toward a different future, one more aligned with where automotive technology was heading, and the sport had chosen instead to protect the past. He lived long enough to watch everything he predicted come true everywhere except the one place he'd tried to make it happen first. Smokey Yunick died in 2001. He never saw a turbocharged engine compete in a NASCAR points race. He never received an official acknowledgement from the sanctioning body that his 1974 project had been handled unfairly. He never got the apology that the historical record clearly suggests he deserved. What he got instead was something more durable than any of those things. He got to be right. Completely, demonstrably, historically right in a way that becomes more obvious with every passing year. NASCAR is currently developing hybrid powertrains for its next-generation racing platform. The conversations happening inside the sanctioning body right now, about electrification, about forced induction, about smaller displacement engines producing competitive power through technology rather than cubic inches, are conversations that Smokey tried to start in 1974. The sport is arriving, 50 years late, at conclusions Smokey demonstrated with a truck engine and a turbocharger before most of its current fans were born. Here's what most people don't realize when they hear this story for the first time. The turbocharged 292 wasn't just an engineering achievement. It was a question, a specific, pointed, undeniable question directed at everyone who had ever assumed that the way things had always been done was the same as the way things had to be done. Smokey asked that question with dyno numbers and lap times instead of words, and the answer he got back told him everything he needed to know about the difference between a sport that valued innovation and a sport that merely claimed to. The engine sits somewhere now, likely in pieces, scattered across collections and museums, a physical artifact of a moment when the future showed up uninvited and got turned away at the door. But here's the thing about futures. They don't actually need an invitation. They arrive regardless. Every turbocharged engine currently humming under the hood of a BMW, a Ford, a Toyota, every hybrid racing powertrain being developed for the next generation of competition, every engineer who understands that forced induction extracts more from less, they're all living in the future Smokey pointed toward from a Daytona garage half a century ago. The truck engine that humiliated NASCAR's finest lost the political fight completely. It won the engineering argument permanently. And in the long run, across the full sweep of automotive history, the engineering argument is the only one that actually matters. Politics change. Rules change. Financial interests shift and evolve. But physics stays constant, and Smokey Yunick understood physics better than the people who stopped him ever understood power. That's the legacy of the most politically inconvenient engine in racing history. Not a trophy. Not a championship. Just the quiet, persistent, irrefutable confirmation that he was right all along.